The village of Willow Creek had always been a sanctuary of peace, where life moved at the pace of a gentle stream. Surrounded by lush green hills and dotted with charming wooden cottages, the town seemed untouched by time. At its heart stood St. Michael's Church, a modest yet beautiful building with whitewashed walls and a bell tower that rang out each morning, calling the faithful to prayer. For decades, the church had been a beacon of hope, and its priest, Father William, was the soul of the community. Father William, at the age of 98, was nothing short of remarkable. Frail in body but sharp in mind, his presence radiated calm and wisdom. His silver hair framed a face marked by age, but his piercing blue eyes shone with an unyielding spark of life. The villagers adored him for his kindness, his unwavering dedication, and the way his sermons seemed to speak directly to their hearts. For them, he was just Father William, the kind old priest who had devoted his life to serving God and his people. But Father William carried a past that no one in Willow Creek knew about, a past he had locked away decades ago, one that he prayed would never resurface. Long before he donned the priest's collar, William had lived through events that had shaped him into a man far different from the serene figure the villagers knew today. It was a life he had deliberately left behind, seeking solace and redemption in the quiet embrace of the church. One warm summer evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, an unfamiliar sound disrupted the peace. The roar of motorcycles echoed through the valley, growing louder as it approached the village. The villagers froze, their daily routines interrupted by the sudden intrusion. 3 men on motorcycles rolled into town, their leather jackets emblazoned with a symbol none of the locals recognized. They parked outside St. Michael's Church, their boots crunching against the gravel as they dismounted. With sneers plastered across their faces, the men pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the church. Inside, Father William stood at the altar, arranging candles for the evening prayer. He turned to greet the strangers, his kind eyes meeting their mocking gazes. The air grew thick with tension as the outlaws sauntered toward him, their disrespect evident in every step. Little did they know, this was no ordinary priest. The outlaws strolled into the church as if they owned the place, their boots scuffing the polished wooden floors. The leader, a tall man with a jagged scar running down his cheek, glanced around with disdain. Behind him, his 2 companions, a wiry, nervous-looking man and a burly brute with arms like tree trunks, grinned wickedly. Their presence was like a dark storm cloud rolling into the tranquil sanctuary of St. Michael's Church. Father William, standing at the altar, watched them with an unshakable calm. "Good evening," he said, his voice steady and warm. "How may I help you, gentlemen?" The scarred leader let out a low chuckle. "We're not here for a sermon, old man," he sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "We were just passing through your quaint little town and thought we'd take a look around." Father William's gaze didn't waver. "You're welcome here, as is anyone seeking peace or guidance, but this is a house of God, and I ask that you treat it with respect." The nervous outlaw let out a high-pitched laugh. "Respect," he echoed, glancing at his leader. "I think the old man's confused about who's in charge here." The leader smirked and stepped closer to the priest. "We don't take kindly to being told what to do, Padre, especially not by someone who looks like a strong gust of wind could knock him over." Father William didn't flinch. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, locked onto the leader's. "Strength comes in many forms," he replied quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made the men pause, if only for a moment. The burly outlaw, tired of the banter, reached out and shoved a nearby candelabrum, sending it clattering to the floor. The sound echoed through the church, and a few villagers peeking through the open doors gasped in horror. "You see, old man," the leader said, his smirk widening, "we like to leave a mark wherever we go, a little reminder that we were here. Maybe we'll start with this quaint little church of yours." Father William's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. It wasn't fear, it was something deeper, something the outlaws couldn't quite place. "Do what you must," he said, his tone almost daring them. "But remember, actions carry consequences." The leader scoffed. "Is that supposed to scare us? You're just an old priest with 1 foot in the grave." But as he turned to his men, Father William took a slow step forward. For the first time, his frailty seemed to fade, replaced by a quiet strength that was impossible to ignore. His voice, calm but firm, cut through the tension like a blade. "You don't know me, son," he said. "You don't know what I've seen, what I've done, and you certainly don't know what you're walking into." The outlaws exchanged uneasy glances. The nervous one shifted on his feet, his bravado slipping. "Boss," he muttered, "maybe we should just get out of here. This place gives me the creeps." The leader glared at him. "Shut up, Danny. We're not leaving until I say so." Father William took another step forward, his piercing gaze fixed on the leader. "I've seen men like you before," he said, his voice low but steady. "Men who think their strength lies in their fists and their cruelty. But let me tell you something, it doesn't. True strength comes from within, and it's not something you'll find by terrorizing an old man." The burly outlaw laughed, a deep, guttural sound. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said, cracking his knuckles. "But guts won't save you." As the tension reached its breaking point, the doors of the church creaked open, and Sheriff Tomlin entered, his hand resting on the hilt of his revolver. "Evening, gentlemen," he said, his voice calm but authoritative. "Is there a problem here?" The outlaws froze, their arrogance faltering under the sheriff's steady gaze. "No problem at all," the leader said, forcing a grin. "Just having a friendly chat with the padre." Sheriff Tomlin's eyes narrowed. "Friendly, huh? Doesn't look that way to me. Maybe it's time you moved along." The leader hesitated, his jaw tightening. He glanced back at Father William, who stood motionless, his eyes still locked onto the outlaws. For a moment, the leader looked like he might argue, but then he spat on the floor and motioned for his men to follow him. "We'll be seeing you, Padre," he said over his shoulder as they walked out. "Count on it." As the roar of their motorcycles faded into the distance, Father William turned to Sheriff Tomlin and nodded. "Thank you, Sheriff," he said. The sheriff tipped his hat. "Don't mention it, Father. But something tells me this isn't the last we've seen of those boys." Father William's gaze lingered on the open doors, a shadow of his old self flickering behind his calm demeanor. "No," he murmured. "It isn't." The village of Willow Creek returned to its usual calm after the outlaws' departure, but an air of unease lingered. The villagers gathered in small clusters at the market and the cafe, whispering about the men who had invaded their sanctuary. The sheriff made his rounds, reassuring everyone that he'd handled the situation, yet the memory of their sneers and their disrespect toward Father William left an unsettling mark on the community. Father William, however, remained calm. He spent the next morning tending to the church grounds, his hands steady as he pruned the rose bushes and swept the cobblestone path leading to the entrance. To the casual observer, he appeared unbothered, almost indifferent to the events of the previous day. But inside, his mind was racing. He had seen men like those outlaws before, reckless, dangerous, and driven by a misguided sense of power. They reminded him of another time, another life. As he worked, a young boy named Samuel approached, clutching a small book to his chest. Samuel was one of the priest's most frequent visitors, always eager to hear his stories or help around the church. "Father William," he said hesitantly, "are you okay? Those men, they were scary." Father William paused and gave the boy a reassuring smile. "I'm fine, Samuel. And you don't need to worry about those men. The sheriff and I will make sure they don't cause any more trouble." Samuel nodded, but looked unconvinced. "They were mean. Why didn't you tell them to leave?" Father William placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "Sometimes, Samuel, the best way to deal with people like that is to show them patience and strength. Anger only feeds their fire." Samuel tilted his head, considering the words. "But what if they come back?" The priest's expression grew serious for a moment before softening again. "If they do, we'll handle it. Remember, strength isn't always about fighting. It's about standing firm in what you believe." Meanwhile, in a rundown cabin at the edge of the woods, the outlaws were regrouping. The leader, known as Jack Scar Delaney, paced back and forth, his boots thudding against the wooden floor. "That old man thinks he's untouchable," he growled. "Nobody talks to me like that and gets away with it." Danny, the nervous outlaw, sat on a rickety chair, fidgeting with a cigarette. "Maybe we should just move on, Jack. This town's not worth the trouble." Jack stopped and glared at him. "Move on? After the way that priest looked at me, no way. We're not leaving until we've made our mark. People need to know who we are." The burly outlaw, known as Red, chuckled. "What's the plan, boss?" "We torch the place." Jack's lips curled into a menacing grin. "Not yet. We'll start small, show them what happens when they mess with us. Then we'll deal with that priest." Back in the village, Sheriff Tomlin visited Father William at the church. He leaned against the doorway, his hat tipped low over his eyes. "Father, I've been hearing some rumblings," he said. "People are worried those men might come back." Father William set down his broom and faced the sheriff. "They might," he admitted. "Men like that don't take kindly to being challenged." The sheriff sighed. "I've dealt with outlaws before, but these ones, there's something different about them. They're not just passing through, they're looking to make a statement." Father William nodded, his expression unreadable. "Then we'll have to be ready." The sheriff gave him a long look. "You seem awfully calm about all this." "I've lived a long life, Sheriff," the priest replied. "Seen more than my share of trouble. Worrying doesn't help." Tomlin shook his head. "Just the same, I'll be keeping an extra eye on things. You let me know if you see or hear anything." As the days passed, the outlaws began their campaign of intimidation. Small acts of vandalism appeared throughout the village. Broken windows, graffiti on the church walls, and livestock let loose from their pens. The villagers grew more fearful, locking their doors at night and avoiding the streets after dark. Father William remained a pillar of calm, quietly cleaning up the messes and offering words of comfort to those who sought solace in the church. But beneath his calm exterior, a fire was beginning to burn. The outlaws' actions were no longer just an affront to the village. They were a direct challenge to everything he stood for. Late one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Father William sat alone in the church, the flickering candlelight casting shadows on the walls. He opened a small weathered box hidden beneath the altar. Inside were fragments of his past, a worn photograph of his platoon, a military insignia, and a journal filled with names and dates he could never forget. His fingers brushed the insignia as memories flooded back, memories of a young soldier who had seen the worst humanity had to offer and had vowed to leave that life behind. But now, it seemed, the past was calling him back. Father William closed the box and sat in silence, his gaze fixed on the crucifix above the altar. "Forgive me, Lord," he whispered, "but some battles must be fought." The night air was heavy with tension as a full moon cast its silver glow over Willow Creek. The village had grown quieter than usual, its residents uneasy after days of escalating intimidation. The outlaws had made their presence known with broken windows, stolen goods, and crude graffiti that marred the once pristine walls of St. Michael's Church. The sheriff had increased his patrols, but even his presence couldn't quell the fear creeping into the hearts of the villagers. Father William, however, remained unshaken. Each day, he carried out his routine as if the outlaws' actions were nothing more than a passing storm. But inside, he was preparing. The time for patience and forgiveness, he knew, was running out. Late one evening, as the villagers locked their doors and dimmed their lights, the outlaws made their next move. Jack Ascard Delaney and his men rolled into the village square on their roaring motorcycles, the sound shattering the stillness of the night. This time, they came with a more brazen plan. They dismounted in front of the church, their boots crunching against the gravel. Jack held a can of gasoline in one hand and a lit cigarette in the other. His men followed, carrying crowbars and sledgehammers. Their intentions were clear. This was no longer about intimidation. It was about destruction. Inside the church, Father William sat in the front pew, a candle flickering beside him as he read from a weathered Bible. The sound of the motorcycles had alerted him, but he didn't move. He remained seated, his eyes scanning the sacred text as if nothing unusual were happening. The heavy wooden doors of the church burst open, slamming against the walls. Jack strode in first, his men close behind. "Evening, Padre," he drawled, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Thought we'd pay you another visit." Father William closed the Bible gently and rose to his feet, his movements slow but deliberate. "You've come late," he said calmly. "The evening prayer is over." Jack laughed, his voice cold and sharp. "We're not here to pray, old man. We're here to make a statement." The burly outlaw, Red, stepped forward and swung his sledgehammer at a row of wooden pews. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the church. Danny, the nervous one, hesitated, glancing nervously at Jack. "Boss, maybe we should—" "Quiet!" Jack snapped, glaring at him. He turned back to Father William, his grin widening. "You've had your chance to walk away. Now, we're going to burn this place to the ground, and you can watch while we do it." Father William's eyes never left Jack's. "This is a house of God," he said, his voice steady. "You will not destroy it." Jack smirked. "And who's going to stop us?" "You." He tossed his cigarette onto the stone floor, grinding it under his boot. "You're just an old man." The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with the smell of gasoline as one of the outlaws began pouring it along the pews. But then, something unexpected happened. Father William stepped forward, his frail frame straightening. His calm demeanor gave way to something more commanding, almost formidable. "You don't know who I am," he said, his voice low but filled with an intensity that made the outlaws pause. Jack narrowed his eyes. "What are you talking about?" Father William took another step forward, his piercing gaze fixed on the leader. "You see an old priest, but once I was a soldier. I've faced men far more dangerous than you, and I've walked away." The outlaws exchanged uneasy glances. Danny took a step back, his hand trembling as he held his crowbar. "Boss, maybe we should just go." "Shut up, Danny," Jack barked, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. Father William continued, his tone unwavering. "This isn't just a church, it's a sanctuary, and I will defend it with everything I have." Jack's smirk faltered as he saw the fire in the old man's eyes. For the first time, he realized that Father William wasn't bluffing. There was something about him, something formidable and unyielding, that sent a shiver down his spine. Before Jack could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the church. Sheriff Tomlin appeared in the doorway, his revolver drawn. "Evening, boys," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I suggest you put down those tools and step outside." The outlaws froze, their bravado crumbling under the sheriff's steady gaze. Jack hesitated, his jaw tightening. He glanced back at Father William, who stood tall and resolute, his presence almost larger than life. "This isn't over," Jack growled, motioning for his men to follow him. They retreated, their footsteps heavy with frustration and humiliation. As they disappeared into the night, Father William turned to Sheriff Tomlin. "Thank you, Sheriff," he said quietly. Tomlin nodded. "I've got a feeling they'll be back. You going to be okay?" Father William's gaze lingered on the shattered pews and the faint smell of gasoline. "I'll be ready," he said simply. The morning after the confrontation at the church, Willow Creek was abuzz with quiet murmurs. News of the outlaws' brazen attack had spread quickly, and the villagers were torn between fear and admiration for Father William's calm defiance. The sight of the shattered pews and the faint scorch marks on the stone floors served as a chilling reminder of how close the church had come to being destroyed. Father William spent the early hours of the day repairing what he could. His hands, though aged, moved with purpose as he swept away debris and gently sanded the jagged edges of the damaged pews. A few villagers stopped by to offer help, but most simply stood at the doorway, hesitant to step inside. "Father, are you sure you're okay?" asked Mrs. Higgins, an elderly woman clutching her rosary tightly. "Those men, they'll come back, won't they?" Father William paused, leaning on his broom as he looked at her. "Perhaps they will," he admitted, his voice steady. "But this is our church, our sanctuary. It will stand as long as we do." The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. They admired his courage, but the fear in their eyes was unmistakable. "What if they hurt someone next time?" another villager asked. "What if they burn the whole town?" Father William straightened, his frail frame seeming to grow taller. "Fear is what they want," he said. "They thrive on it, but we cannot let them control us. We must stand together, as a community." The words resonated with some, but others remained skeptical. Fear, after all, was a powerful force, and not everyone had the inner strength to face it as Father William did. Meanwhile, at the sheriff's office, Tomlin was devising a plan. The encounter at the church had left him shaken, not because of the outlaws, but because of Father William's transformation in that moment of confrontation. The priest had always been a pillar of wisdom and peace, but there was something else now, a fierce resolve that Tomlin couldn't quite place. He called his deputy, a young and eager man named Carson, into his office. "We need to be ready," Tomlin said. "Those men aren't done with us." Carson nodded. "What's the plan, Sheriff?" Tomlin leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "We'll increase patrols around the village, keep an eye on the church, and make sure the townsfolk feel safe. But I've got a feeling that if those men come back, it won't just be a sheriff's job to deal with them." Carson frowned. "What do you mean?" Tomlin hesitated before speaking. "Father William, there's more to him than meets the eye. I've seen it. I don't know what his story is, but he's not just some frail old priest. If those men push him too far, they might regret it." Carson's eyes widened. "You think he can handle himself against them?" Tomlin nodded slowly. "I don't just think it, I know it." Back at the outlaws' hideout, Jack Delaney was fuming. He paced the floor, his mind racing with thoughts of revenge. "That old man thinks he's tough," he snarled. "Thinks he can stand up to me. Well, he's about to learn the hard way." Danny, sitting in a corner and nervously fidgeting with a deck of cards, looked up. "Boss, maybe we should just leave it alone. The sheriff's watching us now. And that priest, and there's something off about him." Jack slammed his fist on the table, making Danny flinch. "Are you scared of a priest, Danny? Is that what you're telling me?" "It's not that," Danny said quickly. "It's just, I've got a bad feeling, that's all." Red, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, chuckled. "Let him have his bad feeling, boss. We've got work to do." Jack grinned, his anger giving way to a twisted sense of satisfaction. "Exactly. We'll hit them where it hurts. Not just the church, this whole town. Let's see how tough they are when their homes go up in flames." Back at the church, Father William stood before the altar, his hands resting on the weathered wood. The villagers had left, and the sanctuary was quiet once more. He closed his eyes, his thoughts drifting to memories he had long tried to bury. Images of war, of comrades lost, of battles fought in distant lands, flooded his mind. He opened his eyes and looked up at the crucifix. "I chose this path to leave that life behind," he murmured. "But sometimes, Lord, the battles find us anyway." That night, Father William made his way to the back of the church, to a small storage room that hadn't been opened in years. Inside was a chest, its metal edges rusted and its lock dusty. He knelt before it, his hands trembling slightly as he unlocked it and lifted the lid. Inside lay the remnants of his past, a carefully folded military uniform, a pair of polished boots, and a box of medals. But beneath them, wrapped in a worn cloth, was something else. A sidearm, its surface still gleaming despite the years. He lifted it carefully, the weight of it both familiar and heavy with meaning. Father William placed the sidearm on the table, his resolve hardening. If the outlaws came back, they would not find the same priest they had mocked. They would face the man he had once been, a soldier who had fought for his life and the lives of others. The quiet tension in Willow Creek only grew as days turned into a week. Though the outlaws hadn't yet returned, their ominous presence lingered in every creak of a door and every shadow stretching across the village square. The villagers tried to go about their daily lives, but fear hung heavy over them. And while Father William seemed calm on the surface, he knew the storm wasn't over. But it wasn't just the threat of the outlaws that troubled the priest. A new complication arose in the form of Lucas, a young man from the village who had always struggled to fit in. Lucas had grown up an orphan, raised by the community but never feeling truly at home. He idolized strength and power, traits he thought he lacked. And when the outlaws came to Willow Creek, something about their brazen confidence captivated him. Late one evening, when most of the village was already asleep, Lucas ventured out of his small home, clutching a makeshift satchel. He'd been restless since the outlaws first arrived, and curiosity had finally gotten the better of him. He'd overheard whispers at the market about their hideout at the edge of the woods, and now, with adrenaline pumping through his veins, he decided to find it. It didn't take long for Lucas to stumble upon the run-down cabin. He could hear laughter and the clinking of bottles inside. He hesitated, doubt creeping into his mind, but his desire for acceptance and admiration pushed him forward. Jack Delaney was the first to notice him when he knocked on the cabin door. Jack's scarred face broke into a smirk as he looked Lucas over. "Well, what do we have here? A stray?" Lucas swallowed hard but managed to speak. "I want to join you." The room erupted in laughter. Red leaned forward, his bulky arms resting on the table. "Join us, kid? Do you even know what we do?" Lucas nodded, though his confidence was shaky. "You're strong. You don't take orders from anyone. That's what I want." Jack studied him for a long moment, his smirk fading into something more calculating. "You've got guts showing up here. I'll give you that. But guts aren't enough." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You want to prove yourself. You'll have to earn it." Meanwhile, back in the village, Father William was growing increasingly concerned about Lucas. He had noticed the boy's distracted demeanor and his sudden disappearance from the church's evening gatherings. When he asked around, some villagers admitted they'd seen Lucas wandering near the woods, but no one knew for sure what he was up to. The priest decided to investigate. Early the next morning, before the sun had fully risen, he made his way to the edge of the woods, his steps careful and deliberate. As he approached the area where the outlaws were rumored to be hiding, he paused, his senses heightened. He could hear faint voices in the distance, though he couldn't make out the words. What he found chilled him to his core. Hidden behind a cluster of trees, Father William saw Lucas standing outside the cabin, talking with Jack. The boy's posture was uncertain, but his eagerness to impress was evident. Jack handed Lucas a small wrapped package and said something that made the boy nod solemnly before heading back toward the village. Father William waited until Lucas was out of sight before retreating quietly. He returned to the church and sat in his study, troubled by what he had seen. It was clear that Lucas was being manipulated by the outlaws, but the priest also understood the boy's longing for belonging. Later that day, Lucas arrived at the church, the package hidden in his satchel. He tried to act normal, but Father William could see the conflict in his eyes. "Lucas," the priest said gently, "I noticed you've been spending time away from the village. Is everything all right?" Lucas froze for a moment before forcing a smile. "Yeah, everything's fine, Father. Just needed some time to think." Father William didn't press further, but his calm gaze lingered on the boy. "If there's anything you want to talk about, you know you can always come to me." Lucas nodded quickly and excused himself, leaving the church with the package still clutched tightly in his bag. As the sun set over Willow Creek that evening, Lucas stood in the shadows of the village square, his heart pounding. Jack's instructions echoed in his mind. "If you want to be one of us, you have to prove it. Place this in the sheriff's office and don't get caught." But as Lucas approached the sheriff's office, doubt began to creep in. He wasn't sure what the package contained, but he knew it couldn't be good. His hands trembled as he reached for the door, his mind racing with conflicting emotions. Unbeknownst to Lucas, Father William had been watching him from a distance, his suspicions confirmed. The priest stepped out of the shadows, his voice calm but firm. "Lucas, whatever they've asked you to do, it's not worth it." Lucas spun around, his eyes wide with fear and guilt. I didn't mean to." Father William stepped closer, his gaze steady. "It's not too late to make the right choice. Come with me, and we'll figure this out together." Lucas froze, the package clutched tightly in his trembling hands. Father William stood just a few feet away, his calm but firm demeanor both reassuring and unyielding. The young man's mind raced as he tried to process the moment, his fear of disappointing the outlaws clashing with the growing guilt in his chest. They said I'd belong," Lucas stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of his emotions. "They said if I did this, I'd prove myself." Father William's expression softened, though his voice remained steady. "Belonging isn't earned through fear, Lucas. It's built through trust and love, and the people who truly care for you would never ask you to hurt others." Tears welled in Lucas's eyes, and for a moment, he looked like a lost child rather than a young man teetering on the edge of a grave mistake. "I just wanted to be strong," he whispered. "I'm tired of feeling like I don't matter." Father William stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on Lucas's shoulder. "You do matter. To me, to this village. Strength isn't about the choices others force you to make. It's about having the courage to make the right ones, even when it's hard." Lucas hesitated, his grip on the package loosening, but then a voice interrupted them. "Well, isn't this touching?" Jack Delaney's drawl cut through the night like a blade. He and his men emerged from the shadows, their faces twisted into mocking grins. Jack's scar caught the dim light, making him look even more menacing. The good old padre saving the lost lamb. How noble. Lucas stepped back instinctively, the package slipping from his hands and landing with a muffled thud on the ground. Jack's eyes flicked to it before narrowing on the young man. "I gave you a job, Lucas, and you were going to let him talk you out of it." Lucas stuttered, glancing between Jack and Father William. The weight of his guilt and fear was almost paralyzing. Father William, unshaken, stepped between Lucas and the outlaws. "He doesn't owe you anything, Jack, and he won't be part of whatever scheme you're running." Jack smirked, his hand resting on the handle of a knife strapped to his belt. "You think you can protect him, old man, so you don't know who you're messing with." Father William met his gaze, his calm exterior masking the storm of memories stirring inside him. "No, Jack," he said quietly, "you don't know who you're messing with." The tension in the air was palpable. Danny shifted uncomfortably, his nervous energy betraying his growing unease. "Boss, maybe we should just let it go. The kid's not worth it." "Shut up, Danny," Jack snapped, his anger flaring. "This isn't about the kid. It's about respect. And I'm not leaving until I get mine." Lucas, still frozen with fear, watched as Father William took a step forward. Though his frame was frail, there was a strength in his posture that made even Jack hesitate. "Respect isn't taken by force," the priest said, his voice steady. "It's earned, and you've done nothing to earn it." Jack's smirk faltered for the briefest moment before he forced it back. "You talk a big game, Padre, but let's see how tough you really are." Before anyone could react, Jack lunged, his knife glinting in the dim light. But Father William moved with a speed and precision that stunned everyone, even himself. He sidestepped the attack, his hand shooting out to grab Jack's wrist. With a swift motion, he twisted the knife from Jack's grasp and sent it clattering to the ground. The other outlaws stood frozen in shock as Father William, breathing heavily, stepped back and dropped the knife at his feet. "Enough," he said, his voice firm. "This ends now." Jack staggered back, his face a mixture of shock and rage. "Hayat, what the hell are you?" Danny took another step back, his eyes wide. "Boss, maybe we shouldn't mess with him. He's not just some priest." Jack glared at his men, his pride wounded. But before he could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps broke the standoff. Sheriff Tomlin and Deputy Carson appeared, their weapons drawn. "Evening, Jack," the sheriff said, his voice calm but authoritative. "I think it's time you and your boys called it a night." Jack sneered but didn't argue. He motioned for his men to follow, shooting one last glare at Father William. "This isn't over," he growled before disappearing into the shadows. As the outlaws retreated, Lucas sank to the ground, his body trembling. Father William knelt beside him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's over for now," he said gently. "But you need to make a choice, Lucas. The path you're on, it doesn't lead anywhere good." Lucas nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry, Father. I didn't know what I was getting into." Father William helped him to his feet. "It's not too late to turn things around, but it starts with being honest, with yourself and with this community." As the sheriff approached, Father William met his gaze. "We need to prepare, Sheriff," he said quietly. "They'll be back, and next time it'll be worse." Tomlin nodded grimly. "We'll be ready, and I'm counting on you, Father." The quiet of Willow Creek felt heavier than ever in the days following the confrontation. The outlaws might have retreated, but their presence still loomed over the village like a storm waiting to break. Rumors spread among the villagers. Some whispered of the courage Father William had shown, while others worried that Jack and his men would return with even greater fury. The tension was palpable, and everyone seemed to be holding their breath. Father William, however, remained composed. Despite his advancing years, he moved through his daily routines with renewed purpose. He spent extra hours at the church, reinforcing the doors and repairing the damage left by the outlaws. Villagers who stopped by noticed the quiet determination in his eyes, a glimmer of something they had never seen before. But beneath his calm exterior, Father William was haunted by a growing realization. The next confrontation wouldn't be a simple warning. Jack Delaney wasn't the type to let humiliation slide. Late one evening, Father William sat alone in his study, poring over old maps of the village and its surrounding areas. He knew the outlaws' hideout wasn't far, and he suspected they were watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. His fingers traced the lines of the map, memories of his military days surfacing unbidden. He hadn't planned strategies in decades, but the instincts came flooding back as if no time had passed. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. When he opened it, Sheriff Tomlin stood on the threshold, his face lined with concern. "Evening, Father," the sheriff said. "Mind if I come in?" Father William stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. "Of course, Sheriff. What brings you by at this hour?" Tomlin removed his hat and sat down heavily in one of the chairs. "We've had reports of strangers lurking near the village perimeter," he said. "Farmers have seen shadows moving in the woods, livestock spooked for no reason." "It's them, isn't it?" Father William nodded. "It's them. They're waiting for us to drop our guard." Tomlin sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I've dealt with outlaws before, but these men, there's something different about them. They're not just after money or supplies. This feels personal." "It is," Father William said quietly. "Jack Delaney feels he's been disrespected. Men like him can't stand losing control. He'll come back, and when he does, he'll try to make an example of this village." Tomlin leaned forward, his voice low. "What about you, Father? He's got a grudge against you now. Do you think you're safe?" The priest met the sheriff's gaze, his expression unreadable. "Safety isn't the priority, Sheriff. Protecting this village is." Tomlin hesitated before speaking again. "Oh, you've been through something before, haven't you? Something that's prepared you for this." Father William's eyes flickered with a shadow of his past. "A long time ago, I made choices I thought I'd never have to face again. But life has a way of bringing things full circle." The sheriff studied him for a moment before nodding. "If there's more I need to know, you'll tell me, won't you?" "You'll know when the time comes," Father William replied. "For now, focus on the village. We need to keep everyone calm and vigilant." As Tomlin left, Father William returned to his study. His thoughts troubled. He knew the sheriff was right. This wasn't just about the village anymore. Jack's vendetta had become personal, and the priest's own past was beginning to resurface in ways he hadn't anticipated. Elsewhere, in the woods near the Outlaws' hideout, Jack Delaney was making plans of his own. The dim light of a lantern illuminated a crude map spread out on the table. Jack's scarred face twisted into a sinister grin as he pointed to various locations around the village. "We'll hit them where it hurts," he said. "Their food supplies, their livestock. We'll cut them off piece by piece until they're begging us to leave them alone." Red leaned over the map, nodding in agreement. "And the priest?" he asked. "What about him?" Jack's grin faded, replaced by a cold, hard expression. "He's mine. That old man made a fool of me, and I don't take that lightly. When we're done, they'll remember my name." Danny, sitting off to the side, shifted uncomfortably. "Boss, are we sure about this? It feels like we're pushing too hard. The sheriff's already watching us, and if we go too far..." Jack slammed his fist on the table, making Danny flinch. "Enough. I didn't ask for your opinion, Danny. If you're too scared, you can leave." Danny muttered an apology, but the unease in his eyes lingered. He wasn't the only one questioning the plan, but none of the men dared to challenge Jack outright. Back in the village, Lucas was struggling with his own guilt. The events of the past week weighed heavily on him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he had played a part in bringing this chaos to Willow Creek. He found himself drawn to the church more often, seeking Father William's guidance and reassurance. One evening, as Lucas helped the priest repair a section of the church's wall, he hesitated before speaking. "Father," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "what if they don't stop? What if they destroy everything?" Father William paused, setting down his tools to look at the boy. "Fear is a powerful weapon, Lucas. It can paralyze you if you let it. But courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting in spite of it." Lucas nodded slowly, taking in the words. "Do you think we can stop them?" The priest's gaze was steady. "We can, but it won't be easy, and it won't come without sacrifice." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the village, Father William prepared for the inevitable. He knew the next move belonged to Jack Delaney, and it was only a matter of time before the storm arrived. The village of Willow Creek braced itself for what felt like the inevitable. As the days wore on, the outlaws' threats and movements became more calculated. Farmers found their fences cut and their livestock scattered. Supplies from the general store mysteriously disappeared overnight. Fear began to take its toll on the villagers, and unity started to fray as suspicion crept in. In the middle of this growing chaos, Father William worked tirelessly to keep the community together. He organized meetings at the church, urging the villagers to stay strong and united. "If we stand together, we're stronger than any threat," he told them. "Fear only has power if we let it divide us." The gatherings weren't just about strategy. They became a place for the villagers to share their fears and find solace. During one such meeting, Lucas stood at the back of the church, listening intently. Though guilt still weighed heavily on him, he began to see how his actions had rippled through the community. He felt a growing need to make amends, but he wasn't sure how. After the meeting, Lucas approached Father William, who was extinguishing the church's candles one by one. "Father," Lucas began, hesitating as the priest turned to him. "I want to help. I don't know how, but I need to do something." Father William studied the boy for a moment before placing a hand on his shoulder. "Helping starts with taking responsibility for your actions, Lucas, but it doesn't end there. If you truly want to help, you'll need to find the courage to face the consequences and the strength to do what's right." Lucas nodded, his resolve hardening. "What can I do?" "Stay close to the village," Father William said. "Watch, listen, and be ready. Your moment will come." Meanwhile, Sheriff Tomlin and Deputy Carson were piecing together the outlaws' strategy. Late one night, they rode out to the edge of the woods, careful to remain unseen. They observed the faint glow of lanterns from the hideout and noticed the outlaws' movements growing more frequent. Tomlin sighed, his jaw tightening. "They're planning something big. We need to be ready." "What do you think they'll do?" Carson asked, his voice tinged with worry. "They've been testing us," Tomlin replied, "hitting small targets to see how we react, but it's leading up to something. They're trying to break our spirit." Carson nodded, his grip tightening on his reins. "And Father William?" He's going to be their main target, isn't he? Tomlin's gaze darkened. Without a doubt, but that old he's tougher than any of us thought. He's got a fire in him. And I've got a feeling he's not showing us everything. Back at the Outlaws' hideout, tension was brewing among the gang. Danny, who had always been the most reluctant of the group, was growing increasingly uneasy. He sat outside the cabin, staring into the woods as Red approached him. "What's eating you, Danny?" Red asked, leaning against a tree. "This whole thing," Danny muttered. "It's not like the other jobs we've done. This one feels wrong." Red chuckled, shaking his head. "You've always been the soft ones, Danny. Jack's got a plan and it'll work, you'll see." Danny looked at him, his eyes filled with doubt. "And if it doesn't, what then? We're going up against a whole village, Red. That priest. There's something about him. He's not just some frail old man." Red shrugged. "Doesn't matter what he is. Jack's the boss and we follow orders." Inside the cabin, Jack was finalizing his plans. His map of Willow Creek was now marked with specific targets. The general store, the sheriff's office, and at the center of it all, St. Michael's Church. "We hit them hard and fast," Jack said, addressing his men. "By the time they realize what's happening, it'll be too late." "What about the priest?" Red asked. Jack's eyes narrowed. "Leave him to me." Back in the village, Lucas's opportunity to prove himself came sooner than he expected. While helping Father William with repairs at the church, he overheard two villagers discussing strange noises coming from the far side of the woods. His curiosity piqued. Lucas decided to investigate. Slipping away in the early hours of the morning, Lucas made his way to the edge of the woods. What he found there shocked him. Danny, sitting alone near a makeshift fire, looking more defeated than dangerous. Lucas hesitated, then stepped closer. Danny looked up, startled. "What are you doing here, kid?" "I could ask you the same thing," Lucas replied. "You don't look like you want to be part of this anymore." Danny sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't, but leaving isn't as easy as you think. Jack doesn't take kindly to deserters." Lucas sat down across from him, his voice quiet but firm. "You don't have to do this. You could help us instead. We could stop them together." Danny laughed bitterly. "You're just a kid. What can you do?" "More than you think," Lucas said. "And so can you. You don't have to be like them." For the first time, Danny looked at Lucas with something other than derision. There was a flicker of hope in his eyes, but it was quickly snuffed out by fear. "You don't understand what Jack is capable of." "Maybe I don't," Lucas admitted. "But I know that if we don't stand up to him, he'll destroy everything." Danny fell silent, staring into the fire as the weight of his choices bore down on him. The uneasy truce between Willow Creek and the Outlaws was shattered in the dead of night. It began with the first explosion, a loud jarring sound that echoed through the hills and woke the entire village. Flames erupted from the barn on the outskirts of town, lighting up the sky with an ominous orange glow. The villagers rushed from their homes, panic spreading as the inferno grew. People shouted and scrambled to save what they could, but the fire was too fierce, too fast. Father William stood in the doorway of St. Michael's Church, his heart sinking as he watched the chaos unfold. He knew immediately that this was no accident. This was Jack Delaney's declaration of war. Sheriff Tomlin and Deputy Carson arrived at the scene within minutes, their horses galloping through the village streets. The sheriff's face was set in grim determination as he barked orders to form a bucket line. "We'll deal with the cause of this later," he said to Carson. "Right now, we save what we can." But even as the villagers worked to contain the fire, more trouble was brewing. Another explosion sounded, this time from the general store. The Outlaws were striking multiple targets at once, spreading fear and chaos as they had planned. Jack and his men moved like shadows through the village, their faces masked and their actions swift. They slashed wagon wheels, broke into homes, and left destruction in their wake. Father William knew he couldn't stand idly by. He turned back into the church, where Lucas was waiting, his face pale with fear. "Father, what do we do?" the boy asked, his voice trembling. The priest placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We protect what we can, Lucas, and we stand together." Just as he spoke, the heavy doors of the church burst open and Danny stumbled inside. His face was flushed and his breathing was ragged. "They're out of control," he said, his voice filled with urgency. "Jack's lost it. He's not just trying to scare you anymore, he wants to destroy everything." Father William's eyes narrowed. "Where is he?" Danny hesitated. "He's heading here. He said the church is the heart of the village, and if he takes it down, he'll break everyone." Lucas's face turned pale. We have to stop him? Father William nodded, his resolve hardening. Danny, will you help us? The outlaw shifted uncomfortably, fear and guilt warring in his expression. If Jack finds out I turned on him, you'll have us to protect you, Father William said firmly. But you need to decide now. Danny swallowed hard, then nodded. All right, I'll help. The priest turned to Lucas. Go to the bell tower, ring it as loud as you can. The villagers need to know the church is under attack. Lucas hesitated, then nodded and sprinted toward the stairs. Moments later, the bell began to toll, its deep, resonant sound cutting through the night and rallying the villagers. Father William and Danny quickly barricaded the church doors, using pews and other heavy furniture to create a barrier. The priest retrieved the sidearm he had unearthed days earlier, its weight both familiar and heavy in his hand. He hadn't wanted to use it, but the time for hesitation had passed. Outside, Jack Delaney stood in the village square, his scarred face illuminated by the glow of the fires. Red and the remaining outlaws flanked him, their weapons drawn and their eyes glinting with malice. Jack's voice rang out, sharp and taunting. Father William, come out and face me, old man. Or are you hiding behind that collar of yours? Inside the church, Danny looked at the priest, fear etched into his features. He's not going to stop. No, Father William said quietly. He won't. The priest stepped to the doorway, standing just behind the barricade. Jack, he called out, his voice calm but commanding. This is your last chance to walk away. Jack laughed, the sound cold and cruel. Walk away? You don't get it, do you? This isn't about walking away. This is about proving a point. Father William's eyes locked onto Jack's, his calm demeanor masking the storm of emotions within. And what point is that? That fear makes you powerful. That destruction gives you meaning. You're wrong, Jack. True power lies in building, not destroying. Jack's smirk faltered, just for a moment, before he shook his head. Enough talk. Bring him down. The outlaws surged forward, but before they could reach the church, a gunshot rang out. Sheriff Tomlin and his deputy had arrived, their revolvers drawn. Not another step, the sheriff barked. The outlaws hesitated, their confidence wavering as more villagers began to gather, armed with pitchforks, shovels, and whatever they could find. Lucas, still in the bell tower, called out to them, his voice ringing with unexpected courage. We're not afraid of you. The tension in the square reached a breaking point. Jack's gaze darted between the growing crowd and the church, where Father William stood resolute. For the first time, the outlaw leader realized he was losing control, not just of the situation, but of his men. Red muttered something under his breath, and even Danny, now clearly on the villagers' side, stood firm. Jack, Father William said, his voice cutting through the chaos, it's over. Leave now, and there's still a chance for redemption. Jack's face twisted with rage, but the sight of the armed villagers and the determined priest made him hesitate. The moment hung in the air, fragile and electric, as everyone waited to see what he would do. The village square was a battlefield frozen in time. The villagers, emboldened by the tolling of the church bell and Sheriff Tomlin's arrival, stood shoulder to shoulder, their makeshift weapons clutched tightly. At the center of it all was Jack Delaney, his scarred face contorted in a mixture of fury and disbelief. For the first time, he wasn't in control, and it was driving him mad. Father William stepped forward, his calm voice cutting through the tense silence. Jack, look around you. These people won't let you destroy their home. Leave now, and you might still find a way to live with yourself. Jack's hand hovered over the pistol on his hip. His eyes flickered with uncertainty, but his pride wouldn't allow him to back down. You think you've won, old man? You don't scare me, and neither does this village. Red, standing beside him, shifted uncomfortably. Jack, maybe we should go. This isn't what we signed up for. Shut up, Red, Jack barked, his voice cracking with desperation. None of you move until I say so. The cracks in Jack's authority were becoming evident. Even Danny, who had joined the villagers, looked at his former leader with pity rather than fear. Jack's grip on his men was slipping, and everyone could see it. Father William took another step forward, his sidearm still at his side but held with quiet resolve. Jack, he said softly, I know what it's like to carry the weight of bad decisions. I know the regret you'll feel if you keep going down this path, but it's not too late to stop. Jack's eyes narrowed, his rage bubbling to the surface. Don't pretend you understand me, priest. You don't know what I've been through. Maybe not, Father William admitted, but I know what it's like to fight for the wrong reasons. And I know how it feels to want redemption." Jack hesitated, his hand twitching near his pistol. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the priest's words might reach him. But then the laughter came, cold, bitter, and hollow. "Redemption?" Jack spat. "There's no redemption for men like me." With a sudden, reckless motion, Jack drew his gun and aimed it at Father William. The villagers gasped, and Sheriff Tomlin raised his revolver, but Father William didn't flinch. Instead, he raised his free hand, his voice steady and clear. "Jack, don't do this. You're not a killer, not yet." The words hung in the air, and for a heartbeat, time seemed to stop. Jack's hand trembled, his finger hovering over the trigger, but his rage and pride were too deeply rooted. With a guttural yell, he fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the square. But Father William, anticipating the move, had stepped aside just in time. The bullet struck the church door behind him, splintering the wood. In the same fluid motion, the priest raised his sidearm and aimed not at Jack Armig, but at the ground near his feet. The warning shot landed inches from Jack's boots, sending up a spray of dirt. Jack stumbled back, his bravado crumbling as the reality of the situation set in. The villagers surged forward, led by Sheriff Tomlin, their combined presence overwhelming the outlaws. Red was the first to drop his weapon, his hands raised in surrender. "I'm out," he muttered, stepping away from Jack. The other outlaws quickly followed suit, their faces pale and their courage spent. Jack, however, refused to yield. He pointed his pistol at Father William again, his movements wild and desperate. "I'm not done," he shouted. "I'm not going down like this." Before he could fire, Danny stepped forward, his voice breaking. "Stop, Jack, it's over. You don't have to do this." Jack turned to Danny, betrayal flashing in his eyes. "You too. You're turning on me." "I'm not turning on you," Danny said, his voice filled with emotion. "I'm trying to save you. This isn't who we are. This isn't who you are." Jack's grip on the gun faltered, and for the first time, his anger gave way to something else. Exhaustion. His shoulders sagged, and the fire in his eyes dimmed. Slowly, he lowered the weapon, the weight of his decisions finally catching up to him. Sheriff Tomlin stepped forward cautiously, his revolver still trained on Jack. "It's over," the sheriff said firmly. "Drop the gun." Jack hesitated for a long moment, then let the pistol fall from his hand. It hit the ground with a dull thud, and the fight drained out of him completely. He sank to his knees, his head bowed in defeat. The villagers erupted into relieved murmurs. But Father William remained still, his gaze fixed on Jack. "It's never too late to change," he said quietly. Even now, Jack didn't respond, but the faintest flicker of something, perhaps regret, perhaps relief, passed over his face. As the sheriff and his deputy rounded up the outlaws, Father William turned to Lucas, who had come down from the bell tower. "You showed courage tonight," the priest said, his voice filled with pride. "The kind of courage this village needs." Lucas nodded, his expression determined. "I learned it from you, Father." The night ended with the outlaws being led away in shackles and the villagers beginning the long process of rebuilding. But for Father William, the battle wasn't just about the village, it was about proving to himself that redemption was always possible, even in the face of darkness. The air in Willow Creek was thick with the aftermath of the confrontation. Jack and his outlaws had been subdued, but the tension hadn't lifted entirely. Villagers worked through the night, repairing what they could and comforting each other after the chaos. Though the fires had been extinguished and the immediate threat was gone, the fear lingered. What if Jack's surrender wasn't the end? Father William stood at the church's altar, alone in the flickering candlelight. His hands rested on the worn wood, his head bowed in silent prayer. He had faced countless challenges in his long life, but tonight had tested him in ways he hadn't expected. For the first time in decades, he felt the weight of his past pressing heavily on his shoulders. The soldier he thought he had buried long ago had resurfaced, and though it had saved the village, it had also awakened old wounds. The door creaked open behind him, and Sheriff Tomlin stepped inside. The heavy steps of his boots echoed in the quiet sanctuary. "Father," he said softly, removing his hat, "it's done. The outlaws are in custody. Jack's cooling off in the jailhouse, and his boys won't be bothering us anymore." Father William turned, his expression calm but weary. "Thank you, Sheriff. You did what needed to be done." Tomlin nodded, studying the priest for a moment. "You did too, more than anyone could have asked of you." The priest's gaze drifted to the crucifix above the altar. "It wasn't a role I wanted to return to," he admitted, "but sometimes we're called to fight, even when we'd rather not, Tomlin stepped closer, his voice lowering. "I've seen men like Jack before. They don't go down without a fight. You think he's really done?" Father William's lips pressed into a thin line. "No. Men like him don't give up easily. He may be behind bars now, but his anger won't fade overnight." As if on cue, a loud commotion erupted outside. The church doors flew open and Lucas burst in, his face pale and his chest heaving. "Sheriff, Father, it's Jack. He's escaped." Tomlin's face hardened. "What? How?" Lucas shook his head, struggling to catch his breath. The deputy was locking up when Jack overpowered him. He took his gun and ran into the woods. "The others are still in the jail, but Jack's gone." Father William straightened, his resolve returning. "He'll come here," he said quietly. "The church is his true target. He said it himself. He wants to destroy the heart of this village." Tomlin nodded grimly. "Then we'll be ready. Lucas, gather the villagers. Tell them to stay alert but stay safe. We'll handle this." Lucas hesitated, then ran off to deliver the message. The sheriff turned to Father William, his hand resting on his revolver. "I won't let him hurt anyone else, Father." "I promise you that." Father William placed a hand on Tomlin's shoulder. "Thank you, Sheriff, but I think this is something I need to face." Tomlin's brow furrowed. "You're not suggesting—" "I am," the priest interrupted. "Jack won't stop unless someone confronts him directly. He's not just fighting the village, he's fighting me, and I won't let him hurt anyone else because of his grudge." Tomlin hesitated, then sighed. "All right, but I'm not letting you do this alone." The two men prepared for the inevitable. Father William retrieved his sidearm, its weight familiar and steady in his hand. The sheriff checked his revolver, his face set in grim determination. The church fell silent again as they waited, the candlelight casting long shadows across the walls. Minutes felt like hours before the sound of heavy footsteps echoed outside. The church doors creaked open, and Jack Delaney stepped inside, his pistol drawn and his eyes wild with rage. His face was flushed, and his movements were erratic. He was a man unraveling. "Evening, Father," Jack sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "I figured you'd be here waiting for me. Thought I'd give you one last chance to pray before I finish what I started." Father William stepped forward, his gaze steady. "You've already lost, Jack. The village is stronger than your threats, and your men have abandoned you. This path only leads to one place. Don't make it worse for yourself." Jack laughed bitterly, raising his gun. "Spare me the sermon, old man." "You don't scare me." Tomlin raised his revolver, his voice sharp. "Drop it, Jack. This is your last warning." Jack ignored him, his attention fixed solely on Father William. "You think you're so righteous," he spat, "hiding behind that collar, pretending to be better than me. But I see you for what you really are, a coward." Father William took a slow step forward, his calm demeanor unshaken. "If that's what you think, Jack, then shoot me. But it won't change anything. You'll still be empty. And you'll still be running from the same demons that haunt you now." Jack's hand trembled, his grip on the gun faltering. His breathing grew ragged, and for a moment it seemed as though he might lower the weapon. But then his rage flared again, and he raised the gun higher. Before he could fire, a shot rang out. Not from Jack's gun, but from the sheriff's. The bullet struck Jack in the shoulder, sending him spinning to the ground. His pistol clattered away as he cried out in pain, clutching his arm. Father William approached slowly, kneeling beside the wounded outlaw. "It's over, Jack," he said softly. "You don't have to fight anymore." Jack looked up at him, his face pale and his eyes filled with something resembling regret. "You should have just let me end it," he muttered. The priest shook his head. "Ending it doesn't bring peace. Only forgiveness can do that." As the villagers arrived, drawn by the commotion, Sheriff Tomlin secured Jack and prepared to take him back into custody. The tension in the air began to lift, replaced by a sense of relief. But for Father William, the battle wasn't just physical. It was a reminder that even the darkest souls could find redemption if they were willing to seek it. The village square was eerily silent as the sheriff's men carried Jack Delaney back to the jailhouse. The firelight from earlier destruction still flickered on the horizon, but the immediate danger had passed. Father William stood motionless near the steps of St. Michael's Church, the weight of the night pressing down on him. Though Jack had been subdued, the battle was far from over, for the outlaw leader, for the village, and for Father William himself. Lucas approached hesitantly, his face pale but resolute. "Father," he said, his voice breaking the silence, "is it really over? Will he come back?" Father William turned to the boy, his expression weary but calm. "It's over for now, Lucas," Jack's in custody, and the village is safe. But healing takes time for all of us. Lucas nodded, but the guilt that lingered in his eyes hadn't faded. I should have done more. If I hadn't gotten involved with them in the first place, maybe none of this would have happened. Father William placed a firm yet gentle hand on Lucas's shoulder. Regret is a heavy burden, but it doesn't define who you are. What matters is what you do next, Lucas. You showed courage tonight, more than most. That's what will guide you moving forward. The boy's lip trembled, but he managed a small nod. Thank you, Father. As Lucas returned to the gathered villagers, Sheriff Tomlin approached, his hat in hand and his revolver holstered. He's locked up again, this time under double guard, the sheriff said. But I've got a feeling this won't be the last we hear from him. Father William sighed, his gaze drifting toward the jailhouse. Men like Jack carry their battles within them. Until he faces his own demons, he'll always be at war, whether it's with us or himself. Tomlin studied the priest for a moment. And you've faced your own battles tonight, more than any of us realized. The priest's eyes flickered with a mixture of sadness and resolve. We all have our demons, Sheriff, but tonight reminded me that no matter how far we think we've come, the past has a way of finding us. Tomlin nodded slowly. You're a good man, Father. This town's lucky to have you. The villagers, though shaken, began to regroup. They brought water to douse the last smoldering embers and worked together to repair the damage to homes and buildings. Despite everything, there was a renewed sense of unity, a determination to protect their community no matter the cost. But amid the relief, Father William found himself drawn back into the church, seeking solitude. He knelt before the altar, his hands clasped tightly in prayer. Lord, he whispered, I've done what I thought was right, but tonight I saw a part of myself I had hoped was gone. Forgive me if I've strayed. The silence that followed was comforting in its own way, and for the first time that night, Father William allowed himself to feel the weight of what had transpired. His body ached, not just from the physical exertion, but from the emotional toll of confronting both Jack and the remnants of his own past. As the first light of dawn broke over Willow Creek, a surprising figure entered the church. Danny, the once nervous outlaw, who had defected in the midst of the chaos. He stood hesitantly in the doorway, his hat clutched tightly in his hands. Father, he began, his voice shaking, I don't know what to do. Father William rose slowly, his movements deliberate. You've already taken the first step, Danny. You chose to leave that path behind. That takes courage. Danny nodded, his eyes downcast. But what now? I've done things I'm not proud of, things I don't know if I can ever make right. The priest approached him, his voice gentle but firm. Redemption isn't about erasing the past, it's about choosing a better future. You can start here, with this village. Help rebuild what was broken. Show them who you really are. Tears welled in Danny's eyes as he nodded. I'll do whatever it takes. The two men stood in the quiet of the church, the weight of the night finally beginning to lift. For Father William, Danny's presence was a reminder that even the darkest hearts could find their way to the light. As the morning sun bathed the village in a golden glow, the townspeople gathered in the square. They had weathered the storm together, and though scars remained on their buildings, their land, and their spirits, they had come out stronger. The bell of St. Michael's Church rang out once again, not as a warning, but as a symbol of resilience and hope. Jack Delaney sat alone in his cell, his wounded shoulder bandaged but his pride irreparably damaged. He stared at the floor, the priest's words echoing in his mind. It's never too late to change. For the first time, he began to wonder if they might be true. Father William stood at the edge of the village, looking out over the hills. He knew the fight wasn't truly over. There would always be new challenges, new threats. But for now, Willow Creek was safe. And for the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace, knowing that he had done what was needed to protect the people who had come to mean so much to him. The morning sun bathed Willow Creek in a warm, golden light, as if nature itself was celebrating the village's resilience. Though the scars of the previous night's chaos were still visible, the burned barn, the damaged storefronts, and the shattered windows, there was an undeniable feeling of unity among the villagers. Together, they had faced a formidable enemy and emerged stronger. Father William stood at the steps of St. Michael's Church, watching as the townsfolk worked together to repair the damage. The villagers, who had once been gripped by fear, now moved with a renewed sense of purpose. Even Lucas, who had once doubted his place in the village, was at the forefront, helping to fix a broken fence and encouraging others to keep going. The priest couldn't help but smile as he saw the transformation. Lucas caught his gaze and gave him a nod of gratitude. The boy's courage had blossomed during the ordeal, and Father William knew that Lucas would carry the lessons of the past few days for the rest of his life. As the sheriff approached, wiping sweat from his brow, he gave the priest a small smile. "It's been a long night," Sheriff Tomlin said, his voice tinged with exhaustion, "but I think we're finally turning a corner." Father William nodded. "The village stood together when it mattered most. That's what will carry us through, Sheriff, not fear but unity." Tomlin looked thoughtful for a moment. "You know, Father, you've done more for this town than just hold sermons. Last night, you showed us what true strength looks like. Even Jack couldn't take that away from you." The mention of Jack brought a shadow of sadness to the priest's face. "He's lost, Sheriff, but perhaps now, in the quiet of his cell, he'll start to see a different path." Tomlin nodded, though he didn't seem entirely convinced. "Maybe. If anyone could plant that seed, it's you." As the villagers gathered near the square for a moment of quiet reflection, Father William stepped forward. He stood on the steps of the church, his voice carrying over the crowd. "What we faced last night wasn't just an attack on our village," he began. "It was a test of who we are. And I'm proud to say that we passed that test, not because of one person, but because we stood together." The villagers murmured their agreement, some nodding while others wiped away tears. "Unity is what makes us strong," he continued. "Fear and division are what our enemies want. But we've shown that when we support one another, when we choose courage over fear, nothing can break us." The crowd broke into applause, and for the first time in days, laughter and smiles began to spread. The villagers returned to their tasks with a renewed sense of hope, ready to rebuild and move forward. As the day wore on, Danny approached Father William once more. The former outlaw was still nervous, but there was a glimmer of determination in his eyes. "Father, I meant what I said earlier. I want to help rebuild the village. Maybe it's not much, but it's a start." Father William smiled, his voice warm. "It's more than a start, Danny. It's the first step toward a new life, and I'll be here to guide you." Danny nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. For the first time in a long time, he felt as though he might have a future worth fighting for. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the village, Father William returned to the church. He walked through the quiet sanctuary, the flickering candlelight illuminating the repaired pews and the altar. The battle had tested him in ways he hadn't expected, but it had also reminded him of his purpose. Kneeling before the altar, he clasped his hands in prayer. "Lord, thank you for giving me the strength to protect this village. Thank you for reminding me that even in the darkest moments, there is always light." The tolling of the church bell marked the end of the day, its deep, resonant sound echoing across the hills. For the villagers, it was a symbol of hope and resilience. For Father William, it was a reminder that his work was far from over. This story of Father William and the village of Willow Creek reminds us all of the power of courage, unity, and redemption. Even in the face of overwhelming darkness, we can find strength in one another and within ourselves. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more tales that touch the heart and remind us of the resilience of the human spirit. Share this video with someone who might need a little hope today, and stay tuned for our next story, a tale of unexpected heroes and life-changing decisions. Thank you for watching, and remember, the light shines brightest in the darkest of times.